Welcome to TG Talk, where we talk to the generation about reaching the world for Christ. Hello, I'm Bobby Bosler. Welcome to another episode here of TG Talk. I am very excited about what we're going to be talking about here today. I feel like it's a timely challenge here in the face of this pandemic that we are facing here today. But before I get to that, I just want to give a couple of brief announcements here. I think most of you here who watch TG Talk on YouTube or Facebook are probably aware of thegeneration.org. But I just wanted to point out to you that we've got a couple of somewhat new resources on there. Of course, there is the podcast there as usual, and the podcast is something you can access on thegeneration.org. You can access all the audio to those, but you can also access those on a podcast player of your choice. But in addition to that, something we've done here and there, and we're just starting to pick up on in earnest, is we are publishing articles on thegeneration.org. And I've got two authors particularly that I wanted to focus on here. One is Victoria White. She is actually currently a seminary student at Baptist Theological Seminary. She's got a real heart for God and a heart for young people. And she's been writing an article in a new series of articles, I should say a new category of articles, a For Girls Only series. Now, I have to say for girls only, even though honestly the material anybody could be blessed by. These articles are intended primarily for the young ladies. We also do have other articles that are being written by Will Esiyenko. Will is he's about to graduate from Baptist College of Ministry. He's on the older side of the spectrum, but he traveled with me twice, actually. He traveled with me in the war in 2016 for a few weeks, and then he also traveled with me all summer last summer with the Cola Clash. He was the Coca-Cola team captain, and Will is he's a prolific writer. He is a creative, and he is an evangelist. And I know that the burden and vision of the generation is something that beats in his heart. And so I've been able to see a little bit further down the pipeline than you all are currently able to see, but we're kind of trying to get articles out weekly. It may not end up being weekly indefinitely, but I do want to encourage you to check out those articles. You say, how do I find out those articles? It's really simple. If on the homepage of thegeneration.org, if you'll just scroll on down to the bottom, you will see the recent resources section, and there in that section you should see a number of the different articles. We've color-coded the For Girls category pink, just so you don't confuse those. But I want to encourage you to get on and check out their articles. Lord willing, we'd like to release 2 articles per week, maybe more as God gives us articles. But this is what we're starting with there. So what I want to do here at this time is I want to direct your attention down to Philippians Chapter 3. We finished studying Philippians 1 and 2. And we're now in chapter 3 and verse 1. We're really just going to be focusing on verse 1 here at this time. So if you'll look at the text, keeping everything in mind that we studied up until this point, Paul is in confinement. There's a certain sense in which it's a bad situation, and yet in the midst of his confinement, God is working. He's got a vision from the Lord on what God wants him to do, and he's got a vision from the Lord from what he wants the Philippians also to do, to not live for themselves, but to live for others, just like Timothy, just like Epaphroditus. And so in chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, "Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, to me, indeed, is not grievous, but for you it is safe." Now, there's a couple of angles that I want to get at this from. Firstly, here he says the word finally. And you know, when a preacher says finally, we think either he's ending his sermon or he's just heading into his last point or something like that. But here, obviously, we have the whole book of Philippians in front of us, and this is pretty much the halfway point through the book. And so he's not saying this is the end of my discussion. Literally, the idea of the word finally is the rest or the remaining things. And what he's saying here is, listen, everything that I've talked about for you here thus far is good. Hey, regardless of whether I survive or not, I'm going to rejoice in the Lord, and I want you to rejoice in the Lord. Remember, we talked about that. I'm going to rejoice in the Lord when I stand before Jesus. I want you to rejoice in the Lord whether I survive or whether I get my head chopped off. And he's just gave the example of Timothy and of Epaphroditus. And remember, Epaphroditus is sick. He's coming home, and it would be really tempting for the Philippians to be disappointed and shamed by him. And he's saying, listen, hold on a second. I recognize that in the grand scheme of things, things might not look good right now, but I'm begging for you, not only in what I've directly spoken to you about, but in everything else too. I beg of you, my Philippian friends, rejoice in the Lord. Now, it's really easy when we think of that word rejoice to think of just plastering a plastic smile upon our face, and we pretend that everything is good and hunky-dory. How are you? Rejoicing in the Lord, my friend. And it, honestly, when I think a lot of us think of rejoice, it's fake. He's not here saying to pretend like you're rejoicing in the Lord. He's saying, I actually want you to rejoice in the Lord. What is rejoicing in the Lord anyway? Rejoicing in the Lord isn't just a song. It's not just something that you say to sound spiritual. It's not something that you pretend is true. We mentioned this briefly, but I just want to zoom in on it here today. To rejoice in the Lord is to confidently choose to believe what God says. It's an optimistic expression of faith, even in the face of difficult circumstances. And I personally think that this command right here is exactly what we need in our current crisis as a country. Honestly, young people, I'm a little bit worried because some of our civil liberties are being abused. Some of the things that we hold dear, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to travel, the right to go out and go about our daily lives in some states particularly, is being yanked away from us. And honestly, young people, it'd be really easy to get into fear mode. It'd be real easy, as Ryan talked about in this weekend's podcast, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to that, you need to listen about it. The Panic Promise is an awesome podcast. Wonderful, wonderful challenge. But young people, it's so easy when things seem to be spiraling out of control to think that God is not in control, or to forget that God is in control. And it's so easy to be full of fear, to be full of anxiety, and to be full of faithlessness. And remember, the context of chapter 1 and chapter 2 is difficult moments. Things that honestly, from the outward perspective, seem really, really bad. And Paul is trying to drive their focus from what they could be fearful about to what God is doing. You know, even in Epaphroditus' case, man, this guy who's going to be coming home seeming like he's an absolute abject, embarrassing failure. There's a certain sense in which this command is a hinge from that to what he's going to be talking about. And he's saying, listen, you need to rejoice in what God is doing. Now, there's a difference between rejoicing that's fake and rejoicing that may be something that you don't see, okay? There have been many times in my life in ministry where I've had to rejoice, and I've had to choose to believe God, even though I don't feel it and I don't see it at the moment. I'll give you, for instance, last summer when we were traveling, one travel day, one of our blessed team members hit another car in a parking lot of a Panda Express. That was not a great day. And yet, it was a great day. In fact, I remember Keenan and I, as we were walking back to towards the vehicles, we had just gotten called. We were parked in a different parking lot because I had the trailer, and we were walking back and we looked at each other. And this has been kind of a running joke throughout the summer, but whenever something really bad happened, we would look at each other and we would say, this is going to be good. It's going to be a good week, isn't it? because we had learned that when things are difficult and challenging and trying and look like they're spiraling out of control, God is up to something. And you see this command to rejoice in the Lord. It's to boast in what God's fit to do. It's to choose, instead of focusing on what seems to be going bad, it's to say, God, I believe that you're up to something good. And I don't know about you, but I need to be reminded about that all the time. And I believe that's why here in this verse he says, to write the same things to you, to me indeed is not grievous, but for you it is safe. Have you ever heard a preacher say something he said like over and over and over again? Like maybe here on The Generation, total surrender, total dependence, to turn the world upside down for the gospel of Jesus Christ. If I had a nickel for every time I've said that. But you know, young people, I want you to know that there are some truths that are worth repeating, and furthermore, there are some truths that are absolutely necessary to repeat. Because I don't know about you, rejoicing in the Lord isn't something new. It's not something I haven't heard before, and yet it's something that I constantly need to be reminded of. He says, listen, this isn't grievous for me to talk about this again, and I'm going to continue to talk about this to you because honestly, this is your greatest safeguard in life. For you it is safe, he says. And you know, young people, when we get gripped by fear, we do stupid stuff. We make terrible, fleshly, human decisions. And God does not want us to be driven by fear. He wants us to walk soaring like an eagle above the storm. And the way that we can soar above the storm is by focusing not on our fears, not on things spiraling out of control, but if we will focus on the Lord and confidently declare, God, I believe that you're up to something. You see, rejoicing in the Lord is a positive expression of faith. It is a positive declaration of your confidence that God is on the throne and that God is doing something and that God is up to something. Young people, in this time of crisis, we should not be down in the mouth bemoaning our loss of civil liberties. We shouldn't be worrying about our future. We should not be worrying about whether we're going to catch the coronavirus. We ought to be focused on God and saying, God, I believe you're doing something, and I want to be a part of it, and that will protect your heart and mind. It will protect you from the fleshly, selfish decisions that often are coupled with unreasonable fear. You know, young people, this rejoicing in the Lord is honestly, it's another way of saying the core of what the generation is. Yes, we surrender to the will of God, but we also depend totally upon God to do something that it may not be evident that he's doing, to even in this time turn the world upside down with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.